I would like to introduce Dr. Leslie Hergert here at EDC. She is the facilitator for the Northeast College and Career Readiness Research Alliance, which is our host today, and also the moderator of today's webinar. Good afternoon, Leslie.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for that, and thank you for introducing people to our RELNI and to the Alliance and the Alliance's work. We're very pleased with the turnout for today's webinar. As those of you who've been interested in this topic for a long time know, there's very little research, so we're extremely pleased to be able to feature two very recent studies that are just coming out now. And we think those will help to inform the field and really give us something to talk about and to think about as we do work in this area. We know some of you use terms like standards-based grading, proficiency-based learning, competency-based learning. We're using P/CBL, just to be clear. And each of the presenters will have about 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have time for a few questions and answers from them before we open up a discussion. All of the questions that you submit will be, I'll get to that later. I forgot about the goals, sorry. We'll be presenting research on proficiency and competency-based learning and its implementation in several different districts. We'll also be discussing challenges and facilitators for implementation, and we'll think about and help you think about implications of that research for your practice. So as you listen, you might think about how does this research connect with what you're doing? Are you working on this now, or are there questions that you have about it? What do you want to learn more about? What ideas do you want to share with your colleagues, and what questions do you have for presenters? Anything you'd like to share or questions that you have, you can submit in the chat room. We don't have, we have too many people for an open mic, so this is the way that we can do it, and we'll keep track of all of those questions, even the ones that we don't get to here, because they can help us in our work, as well as all of you will know what kinds of things you're interested in and are concerned about. The goal of the Northeast College and Career Readiness Research Alliance came out of the work of our members, and our goal is to provide research to support the work of the 7 northeastern states that we work with. There is a lot of interest in secondary school initiatives related to increasing graduation rates, and this topic is of particular concern in many of the states and on the planning or thinking about for other states. Our members are on this map. We have members from each of the 7 states, and they range from state department people to local school and district people, as well as some researchers like Erika. And they help to drive the work. 2 studies that we have coming out, Aubrey will talk about at the end, but one is a larger study on definitions and policies, and the other is a shorter policy brief on implications for policy and practice. As we showed you before, we'll have, whoop, what happened? We'll have our first presentation from Erika Stump, and when she finishes, we'll have a little time for questions and answers. So I'm going to turn this over to Erika and introduce her. Erika is from the Maine Education Policy Research Institute at the University of Southern Maine, and has just completed a study of implementation in several Maine districts. So Erika, thank you for your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. It's really an honor to participate today. We have certainly had the privilege of working with the REL, and especially here at the university, because a lot of the work done, especially around this topic, can be feel rather isolated, and so the collaboration with the REL has been fantastic. So my name is Erika Stump, and I'm a research associate at the Maine Education Policy Research Institute. at the University of Southern Maine. And we have recently completed a two-phase study that looks at the implementation of the proficiency-based diploma system that has been legislated here in Maine. And the study has been commissioned by the Maine Legislative Committee for Education and Cultural Affairs. So I'll talk a little bit about the study and our findings, and at the end have a little bit of time for questions. And then also glad to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Steele today, who will present on her research findings, and I believe there'll be more question time for both of us after that as well. The goals of our study were to compile data on the development, costs, and impacts of proficiency-based programs in schools and school districts here in Maine. Again, it was commissioned by the Committee on Education because in 2012, the legislature passed LD 1422 to implement PK-12 proficiency-based diploma systems by 2018 here in Maine's public school systems. Our study was a qualitative case study. It included 17 case studies, 8 schools, and 9 school districts. We looked at schools who were identified as implementing the standards-based education and school districts that were implementing a proficiency-based system. And these were early implementers, so they were people who had begun this process before it had been mandated. The enrollments and free and reduced lunch rates and years of implementation were intentionally arranged to get a sense of how this implementation was being done in schools across the state, as well as schools with various strengths and struggles as well. So the enrollments were 150 to 950 students in the schools, and free and reduced lunch rates from 22 to 60%. And there were schools that had just begun or were beginning to think about this process, as well as schools who had been implementing for over 14 years. So we have a conceptual model that actually is in our report as well, since it appears it's sideways on the slide here. But the key elements of the conceptual model are the ideas that each component, and I will talk about each one of these components throughout the piece, so it's fine that you can't see the model itself. But that there are a variety of components that the schools and school districts we saw said were critical to developing a proficiency-based system. And these components individually were very important and could in fact improve an isolated aspect of a school. However, a lot of the challenges and the enthusiasm around a proficiency-based system is the fact that it's actually a system in which all of the components are being influenced. So scaling up to this systems approach requires implementation of all the components, not just those 1 or 2 or 3. We saw, and we'll talk about this a little more, but we saw that one of the challenges to this is the idea that it's difficult to incorporate the components of the system together in the same way that they were intended by the policy. This is not unique to Maine or to education even. Policy translation is something that's difficult across many venues. Another challenge was a common finding in research around this topic, the idea that the language and the definitions of the terms that were used were not common among schools or even districts across the state. So I'll talk about some of those aspects as we move along. The legislation in Maine the appendix, one of the appendix in our report has the full legislation, which I will spare you from in this webinar, but it basically is an act to identify and implement proficiency-based diplomas in public school PK-12 systems. It was passed by the legislature in 2012, and a couple of the key elements are the idea that it's required for schools to transition to standards-based educational systems and demonstrate proficiency in order to graduate. In Maine, the diploma is awarded, should be awarded to students starting in 2018 based on their proficiency in all 8 content standards that are identified in the Maine learning results and the guiding principles, which are sort of like work study habits or the concepts of being a collaborative worker and whatnot. Students must also be allowed, it's written into the legislation, to use multiple pathways to demonstrate their proficiency, which is a critical aspect that many people talking about competency and standards indicate is really critical to making sure that that work actually is beneficial to students. So the findings, which also follow the conceptual model, but the first piece of the model was the legislation, and that was really an impetus to many of the things that happened. But that in order for this to be successful, many of the schools in our study indicated that there really had to be a strong culture of learning. And some of those schools had that already, so they weren't really focusing on that. They were focusing on maintaining it. But some of the schools were building that to develop more student choice and student voice that seemed to be beneficial to the learning. One student says, I like having more choice about assignments and books. And practitioners felt that this process of proficiency-based actually allowed students to be more engaged in their work. And one middle school principal said students have more tools in their toolbox to talk metacognitively about their learning. As well, we found that aligning curriculum and assessments was a sort of next critical step. Here in Maine, we have been working with some state-level standards for several years. So many of the schools had practice in doing this and were working diligently before this legislation even came down. However, there's also a more concerted effort in this when RTI was implemented. And we also saw then, again, another concerted effort around this legislation. So one of the key findings was that there were robust intervention systems for struggling students, and that there were differentiated approaches to developmental levels. And these things were beneficial to students that were struggling previously. However, one of the challenges was that there were different focuses for different age and developmental levels. So, for example, one administrator said there has to be differences between elementary school and high school implementation of a proficiency-based system. So I think it's critical to honor and respect the training that teachers are given and to understand how those implementations may be different at the different school levels. One of the biggest questions that people have about proficiency and standards-based, for example, looking at the list of questions that you folks submitted, was how does this affect instruction and how can we use this approach to improve instruction? And this was clearly a goal of many of the schools that we saw in our study. One literacy specialist said there was a need for change. We wanted to improve instruction, and they embraced the proficiency-based approach to do that. However, we also saw that it was, again, similar to the previous finding, it was important to honor the different requirements of instruction surrounding developmental levels. And so, for example, the idea of personalized learning and students progressing strictly individually was something that some people were trying to do, but also something that some teachers, especially early childhood teachers, indicated was not the goal of their classroom. So a kindergarten teacher said, differentiated learning is important, but you have to build community first, especially in kindergarten. Students need to know how to be part of the community before they can learn content standards. So we really found that practitioners were exhibiting diligent work to incorporate both their sort of understanding of human development as well as the larger goals of this approach. With this in mind, we did classroom observations in our school study as well, and did not necessarily observe any significant changes in most of the classrooms from a superficial level. A lot of things that this reform talks about with work outside of the classroom, anytime, anywhere learning, isn't really observable in a classroom observation. But we did see a traditional classroom, which we defined as students grouped by their age or their grade level, not by their proficiency levels, 71% of the time. We did see 21% of our classroom observations indicated students were grouped by their proficiency level or they were progressing on individual basis. And then 8% were what we called mixed grade, which sometimes is actually a traditional practice of mixing grades, like having a third and fourth grade classroom or having a classroom that included an integration of students of various ages. One teacher indicated that, again, switching systems to personalized learning didn't mean we lost whole class instruction. So again, there seemed to be work to hybrid between what was already working and some of the new ideas of this reform. So that brings us to a finding around the idea that one of the difficulties of identifying and researching, especially in a very rigorous kind of scientific way, is the fact that many people define and even implement proficiency-based progress and proficient as different things. And so, for example, most practitioners indicated that proficiency-based learning could be defined as students moving on when they had demonstrated proficiency. However, the definition of moving on was different in different schools and school districts that were part of our study. We listed just a couple that we heard. In one school, all students moved on following a traditional teacher pace, and proficiency levels were used to identify just interventions. In another school, students were required to earn a proficient grade in the unit summative assessment to advance to the next unit. And then in another school, students finished assignments at an individual pace, receiving the next task as soon as they completed the previous task. So it's difficult to say whether, I think one of the questions that one of the participants in today's webinar put up was, how do we know when it works? And it goes back to the adage of it depends on how you define it. So it depends on how you define it, and it depends on how you define works. So this study doesn't necessarily make any considerations with that, but it does represent the idea that the definitions are not necessarily common across the state, but the teachers are working diligently to create that. One of the challenges of not having those common pieces was that there wasn't a clear, consistent way of reporting on student progress and achievement. And the Maine Department of Education has been working to provide some guiding materials to help improve consistency. But the districts have the ability to develop reports locally, and so that it was very different in the way that different people were able to do that. And sometimes at the high school level, that translated into some concern about college admissions and about transcripts. And we spoke with college admissions directors at selective schools, four-year institutions, and they indicated that they do get transcripts from all across the world that are very different, but that it, and so one admissions director said, there are lots of different approaches that can work, but the transcript must distinguish course levels and rigor of courses. So I think that this process of trying to find a proficiency-based transcript is still in the works and is being worked on with conversations across post-secondary institutions as well as high schools and guidance. In fact, the high school diploma policies were also a concern for some of the high school principals who indicated that they were working to raise standards and make sure that all students earned proficiency before graduating, as was many of the goals of this approach. However, there was concern about the change in existing diploma systems. One high school principal said, we know there are a number of kids who won't meet the bar, and that is why our district standards are lower. And a special education director raised that there was a population of kids with really prevalent learning problems who right now get a diploma, but what will they get in the future? I am unsure, she said. Professional development was also a critical aspect of this, and we found that it was really important for time to be given to teachers and administrators to develop the work that had to be done. And collaboration was one of the key elements of success in this. It had really broken down isolation among teachers and found collaboration among districts across the state and even within schools in ways that they had never done before. However, many teachers and teacher leaders and teacher associations indicated that this work really needed to be compensated and time needed to be found for this work to be done. Part of this work includes the idea of having a learning management system. So the amount of data that's being used to track students and monitor students was really valuable, and having that collective process of monitoring was really important with parents as well as students and teachers of all grade levels. But keeping track of all of that information as well as having common shared resources to have consistent curricula and goals was a challenge. We spoke with technology personnel who looked at possibilities out there for how to use technology to enhance that type of system, but basically learned that there was not a system that really did all things at this time, and such a system would streamline the amount of time spent on data management. This, plus many of the other aspects, would also allow teachers and administrators to build greater support among the community. And this was critical in terms of gaining support with parents and understanding report cards and grades and how their kids moved through a school system. But it was also important for taxpayer and local funding. That some of the concerns around the approach were that it would not gain taxpayer support. So again, to kind of summarize, the strengths of the system were that there was an extended collective belief and accountability for developing an education system in which all students meet the same standards. And this approach and legislation really brought to the top of the table the idea that all students should have certain skills and knowledge before they finish their high school career. It increased professional collaboration and professional conversations. But a couple of the challenges were the need to adapt traditional practices and policies in order to make the system work, and the balance between understanding whether that was good practice for developmental approaches and what things were most important to the community. Another challenge was also just revising the accountability and assessment systems that are currently in place that are based on age, grade level, or developmental levels, such as standardized tests or teacher evaluation systems that really make it difficult to make the systems change. But there was certainly, again, to summarize, there was certainly enthusiasm for this change and hard work by every person that we spoke to better the education system for children in Maine. This report is available on our website, Implementation of a Proficiency-Based Diploma System, Early Experiences in Maine. And my email is here as well, and I believe the report's also available as a download here in the webinar. So thank you again for the opportunity to share some of the research that we've done, and it's really an honor to be able to, as a former teacher, public school teacher, it's wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to share the voices and the thoughts of practitioners in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Erika. That was really interesting, and the questions that it prompted could each take 10 minutes to discuss. So I'm going to just pull out a couple of them. One that I think raised a concern, on one of your slides, a high school principal was talking about lowering standards because everyone wouldn't be able to meet them.
Right.
The question was that an outlier or is that typical?
I wouldn't be able to identify that sort of statistically since it was a qualitative study, but I think that making that statement outright is certainly an outlier. However, the challenge of holding a higher standard while maintaining current graduation rates was a concern in every high school. In that they were high school teachers and principals knew that they were being evaluated on graduation rates, and so they didn't want those rates to go down. But philosophically, they really did believe that some students needed to be held to a higher standard, and so they were concerned about how to do that in a gradual and a way that benefited the students in their learning.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions that I think are related. One was about how does a personalized path towards readiness play into this kind of system. Another is about students with special needs. And the third was about changes in teaching practice. And I was thinking about the place where teachers said, we don't really see it, that we have to give up whole class instruction. Did you see personalized pathways and differentiated work going on, and how does that play into the idea of reaching competency for all students?
Yes, we did see a fair number of the schools that we visited were working towards finding a good balance between what had traditionally found as good practice and also embracing some of the new approaches to instruction and to educational systems as a whole, such as personalized learning. And so we saw a mix of that there were teachers who were beginning this new reform, so were really demonstrating a lot of those types of practices. But there were also teachers that were learning how to incorporate the basic fundamental aspect of personalized learning where you differentiate learning for individual students so that they don't fall through the gaps or sit around being too bored or something, but that it didn't have to always mean that every student was at a different place. We heard new implementers talk about how they were worried that they would have to create a single lesson plan for every individual student. And for example, a high school teacher who had 150 students on her caseload was very worried that she just would not be able to do that. And classrooms and schools that had been implementing this for a few years had learned that there was a balance to that approach, that it probably benefited them to not just be at the front of the classroom talking at their students without their engagement, but at the same time, whole group instruction was not thrown out. So there was some work to get through both of those. The special needs was something that I would respond to that saying that it probably warrants further study. We did some cursory conversations with special ed directors and teachers, certainly, but I think that that has its own set of concerns. Some of those concerns are being addressed as we speak and were being addressed after this report came out by the Maine Department of Education and special education leaders in the state. But it is a concern in terms of figuring out how to provide interventions and how to award students, recognize them for the work that they're doing, even if they do not or developmentally may not ever meet the content standards. So that is one of the pieces that still is to be worked out, but it appears to be something that the conversation is currently being had here in the state of Maine.
Thanks. I think I'll do one last question, and that's the one about colleges, because you did talk to colleges. And have you seen any transcripts the colleges seem to be able to deal with and respond to? And I would point out to people that in the chat room, Andrea from the Boston Day and Evening Academy said that they have some, and she will send it. And Andrea, if you would send it to us, we'll post it for people. And then Aubrey also put a link to the Great Schools Partnership. Some of those schools have some. But did you hear from colleges anything that would help them be able to assess the transcripts or that they responded positively to?
Sure. Well, to first just put in a context, other organizations have spoken and worked very closely with some of the public institutions and universities, and in fact, the University of Maine at Presque Isle is working to become proficiency-based themselves. However, one of the concerns we heard was from parents and families and students who were applying to highly selective four-year institutions, and we did not see much representation of their perspective in the literature that we reviewed. So those are the college personnel that we spoke to. So it's just one sort of slice of that pie. And all colleges certainly have a different perspective on what they value in terms of admissions. However, the people that we spoke to said while that a proficiency-based or standards-based transcript would not be detrimental at all because they have certainly gotten every type of transcript you can imagine, that they really do a lot to compare students and to see what the rigor of their coursework was. So they look for what classes they're taking and whether they're taking AP courses and whether the GPA that they have is based in a very rigorous curriculum. And I think it's difficult because it's the traditional transcript works for them because it's what they know. And they're so highly selective that they're sort of able to make their own rules. So I think that there is legitimate concern about a transcript that would completely throw out the traditional aspects of that. But I think that there is movement to understand those transcripts and to figure out some of the aspects that are critical within a transcript that you could replicate in a standards-based. And it's probably best to just refer you to the components of the report that talk about that, that there are some good quotes from the college admissions folks there as well. And I know there's also a transcript that is a model transcript that the Maine Department of Education has on their website as well.
Thanks, Erika. We could probably keep going for minutes, but we want to turn now to our next presentation from the RAND people. And Jennifer Steele is going to present the report, but Matt Lewis will join her at the end to answer questions. Jennifer and Matt's study is outside of the state of Maine, I think, in multiple districts around the country. So Jennifer, it's over to you.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Erika. That was very interesting, and I think that the two presentations are very complementary. So this work was undertaken with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and so we start off by defining competency-based education. The title of our presentation, I should say, is competency-based education in 3 pilot programs, and Leslie is correct that these sites were disparate. They're scattered across the country, and all of them had also received funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so we were commissioned to evaluate the programs. And this study, our report from this study is going to be coming out in June of this year. So, and Matt is the principal investigator on the study, and we had a large team as well. So we defined competency-based education based on our interviews with folks in the field to have 3 components. The first is that instruction is tailored to meet students where they are, and that means that instructional pacing may be flexible so that students are progressing at different rates. Second, students have choices to personalize their learning, and so there is an element of student choice that invites engagement and provides autonomy. Third, students are evaluated based not on how much time they spend studying a topic, but based on evidence of the extent to which they have learned or mastered the topic. So students are evaluated based on competency and not based on investment in study. Now, as we know, we can tell 148 people are currently dialed in. We know that competency-based approaches are drawing new attention, and that a majority of states are now offering some type of seat time waiver or alternative to time-based credit, if not something more strong, as Erika was just describing in Maine. So let's see. So the thought leaders in the field, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who funded us, the Nellie Mae Foundation, National Governors Association, and a lot of media have started tuning into this trend as well. What's driving the trend seems to be a confluence of factors. First of all, we have pressure to help all children meet increasingly high standards with the Common Core state standards. We have increasing evidence that just moving students along in the form of social promotion doesn't actually close the learning gaps that students have. And we have improving technology that is making it easier to facilitate personalization of learning. We also have existence proofs in our midst in terms of alternative education and some districts that have tried proficiency-based approaches and offered existence proofs of their success. So we were asked by the foundation to commission evaluate a 2-year pilot where the pilot sites, the grantees, received funding to develop competency-based materials in the 2011-12 academic year and to implement those materials, roll them out to classrooms and teachers in the 2012-13 year. Now, in practice, those 2 years, the activities of those 2 years were a little bit more overlapping. And then 2013-14 was our analysis year after we collected the data. The sites, that we evaluated were actually quite heterogeneous. And this comes back to Erika's point about there being no clear definition of competency-based education. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different programs that were funded by the foundation. Program A was implemented inside of a district that was already doing competency-based education district-wide. That's the context column on the right, and we're talking about top row, Program A. This district, for their grant, they focused on mathematics in grades 8 through 9, and they were developing games and having teachers develop instructional videos so that they could flip their classroom and students could find instructional resources that would allow them to move at their own pace, because kids in this district, Program A, already moved at their own pace as part of how the district worked. The grant also included in all 3 sites an upgrade to the learning management system to make it easier to track students' learning under a competency-based approach. Program B is actually not a district. It's an intermediary organization that was working with 4 schools. 3 were schools of choice, magnet schools in large urban districts. 1 was a district in a regular high school in a small town. They were focused not on mathematics, but on language arts and social studies. So I've got 4 different schools in 4 different districts in 3 different states for Program B. So in a minute, we're going to start disaggregating Program B a little bit more. Program A is 1 district. Program C is also 1 district. Program C is 1 district, very large urban district, that focused on 6 high schools. They didn't revamp the whole district. They focused on 6 high schools. And here, oh, I forgot to say what Programs B and C did. Programs B and C were working on project-based learning and portfolio-based assessment. Students were evaluated for their proficiency using rubrics, and there was a lot of student choice in terms of the types of deliverables that they were producing for their portfolios. And so programs B and C were similar in that way. The tools were aligned to the Common Core State Standards, and Program C focused on grade 9 English Language Arts. So with these heterogeneous programs, we tackled 3 research questions. One of them is, what can we learn about implementation of these heterogeneous approaches? 2 was, how did the students describe their experiences? Because we could only observe a certain number of classrooms on a certain number of days, but we wanted to know, what did students tell us about what was happening in their classrooms? And 3, to what extent did the adoption of a competency-based approach predict student performance? So to collect data, what we did is we visited the sites once in the spring of the first year. We came into the study after the sites had already been chosen. So in the spring of the first year, we visited the sites, and we visited twice in the second year, fall and spring of year 2. During those visits, we interviewed project leaders, developers, teachers. We observed classes. We did a total of 116 interviews and observed 28 classes. We also did student surveys, and that's what you see in this, what you see in this table is the interviews, the observations, and the surveys. And for the student surveys at the end of year 2, we had a 65% response rate across the sites. So then in terms of implementation, we looked at what the programs were doing, and we looked at the 3 defining features of competency-based education. And what you see here in this table, each row is what we define. Each row is a single defining feature. So flexible pacing is at the top, choice to personalized learning is in the middle, and students evaluated on competency is at the bottom. And each column is a site. Program B, as I said, focused on language arts and social studies and had 4 different sites. Program C was language arts focused, had 6 high schools in 1 site. Program A was math focused and was in 1 district. So what we see here is that there was a little bit of a split. Program A was very focused on flexible pacing. Students really moved through content at their own pace, and when they finished something, they moved on to the next thing. And so there was a lot of self-pacing. Students were evaluated with rubrics, and they were also and tests, and then they were evaluated periodically with Scantron-based tests for purposes of reliability. So that was Program A. Program A had some evidence of student choice in terms of online resources, but student choice was really the core kernel through the other sites, and that the other sites were less about flexible pacing and more synchronous. The learning was more synchronous, but students had choices about the projects that they did and the ways in which they showed competency and what went into their portfolios. So programs B and C were a little more similar in that regard. Two of the Program B sites focused on what we call mastery grading, and also so did Program A, which is that students were really evaluated based on evidence of competency according to the rubric and not based on effort. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 implementation tensions, then I'm going to talk about what students told us, then I'm going to talk about outcomes. In terms of implementation tensions, 4 things emerged. One was that teachers disagreed about out-of-school learning. What should count toward class credit? If they do an after-school project, does that count? Teachers disagreed. If they go on a trip and demonstrate competency on an overseas trip where they're doing blogging and they're doing lots of activities, does that count and for how much? So that was a tension. There were no sites that were allowing outside people other than teachers to evaluate students, but some of the sites had hoped to do that and found that it was logistically impractical. Maintaining a common standard. Many teachers said they wanted to reward students based on effort because effort and habits of practice and engagement were so essential to attaining mastery. So they felt that the work going in needed to be incentivized as well, and that the mastery grading made it harder to do that. Another tension was sustainability. The technical barriers that Erika referred to in Maine were present in every site that we looked at. They all built or developed new learning management systems, but the extent those learning management systems were in beta version, they had imperfections, and they didn't always interface well with the other student management systems that existed in the districts. Also, some of the sites didn't have a lot of computers for students to use to get access to the online curriculum resources that were really a key part of competency-based ed. So there were limitations in terms of hardware and in terms of the sustainability of the curriculum tools that were developed. And promoting equity was a challenge in that some teachers said students latched on to competency-based ed in different ways. Teachers at several sites said this is great for kids who are motivated, but there are some students who have trouble in school, and evaluating them on competency is even more stressful, so they're not buying in. In terms of what students said about their classroom experiences, I'm going to show you 2 pieces of the survey. One focuses on flexible pace of learning, and on the x-axis you have the sites A through C. B, again, are the 4 heterogeneous sites. And we asked kids, to what extent do you agree or strongly agree that I work on topics different from my classmates and that I'm given a chance to work at my own pace? And 30 to 40% of students said they're given a chance to work at their own pace among sites. The sites are pretty even, except for B3. And B3 kids were surveyed in a special class that really focused on portfolio-based learning for a kind of final graduation project. So we think that that is part of why B3 tends to be an outlier. So there's a lot of homogeneity overall. Same thing when we ask kids about opportunity for choice. We see less choice in getting to decide how activities are done, about 13 to 17%, except for B3, but a lot of choice in the sense of choosing materials, about 30% of kids agreed, and opportunities to choose topics, about 20 to 30% of kids agree that they could choose topics. So again, B3 was an outlier. Then we looked at outcomes. Outcomes was a little harder in terms of the grants themselves because the sites had different dosages of what they gave kids with the grant materials. Program A, which was focused on math tools and flipped classrooms, really, they developed games and teacher-made videos, but the students really could use those as they chose or not use them. And so there wasn't a super high dosage. Program B built a lot of new curriculum but didn't have time to roll it out, and Program C purchased a new curriculum and rolled it out for a year. Program C also did an after-school piece. So what we did instead is we looked at when the system shifted to competency, and we looked at how kids performed before and after the system, the district, the school, shifting to competency. For 3 of the sites, B2 through B4, they were always competency-based. And for Program C, we did a student-level evaluation because we actually do have kids in treatment and non-treatment schools. So we look first at Program A, and what we do here is we match the treatment district to the comparison district on prior observable characteristics, and then we look at what happened to student performance in the treatment district when they switched to competency, which was in 2009. And in the Program A district, the treatment district, student performance dropped, and it came back up, but it remained about 9 percentile points lower than we would have predicted based on its weighted comparison district in the state. And that is unlikely due to chance. This is the statistical significance of this ranges from the 5 to 10%, and it's only a one-district comparison, so we don't have a lot of power. We use the same approach for Program B1, which is one of the language arts districts that was part of Program B. But this, you have a clear split from the school went to competency, the rest of the state didn't go to competency at the same time. So how did the school do when they switched in 2010? And here we're looking at language arts as the dependent variable. And the school did better by about 4 percentile points than its weighted comparison high school in the state in terms of language arts performance 2 years after competency-based education was implemented. That is not statistically significant. Our treatment district is still right in the middle of the point cloud. It's not really an outlier. So we wouldn't call that significant, but we would say it's encouraging. We looked at the other 3 District B programs, which are focusing on language arts and social studies, and these are all schools of choice, and we have no pre-intervention time when they were not competency schools. So one of those districts scored for percent of kids exceeding state standards, scored 17 percentage points above its demographically similar comparison school in the state. For 2 of the other Program B schools were in the same state. One of them is the orange line on the top, and that school was scoring about 18 percentage points in language arts proficiency rates above its demographically similar comparison group. And the other school in that state, that was Program B4, scored a little bit worse or similar to its demographically similar comparison, but it was a more disadvantaged school overall. So these are all schools of choice in Program B except for Program B1. So no significant difference on that other school. Program C, we have a student-level comparison, and we're looking at how kids performed on the language arts benchmark at fall and spring of the treatment year, fall and winter of the treatment year, and we're looking at their attendance rates and promotion rates. Treatment kids performed statistically significantly better in terms of attendance over the school year by 1.4 percentage points. The others were not statistically different. For kids in Program C who took part in the after-school component, which was also choice-based, project-based, but students had to volunteer to take part, those kids were about 2.8 percentage points above other kids in the district in terms of overall school attendance, and they had 6.3 percentage points difference in promotion to 10th grade on time. But we acknowledge that kids who choose to participate in an after-school program are self-selected to some extent. So putting that all together, we look at this table is aggregating what I've just told you about student outcomes. And so what you have is in the columns on the left, the gray shading indicates what the sites were doing in terms of our defining features of competency-based education. Program A was really strong on competency ed in having flexible pacing and evaluation for competency. They had some choice, but choice was not as central. Programs B1 through C were heavy on student choice in terms of project-based learning, and B1 and B4 were also strong on evaluating kids based on competency and not based on effort. So and then the column on the far right tells you what I've just told you about their effects on student achievement in the subjects that we looked at, which were the subjects relevant to the grant. So we find that flexible pacing is associated with a more negative effect. The student choice models are associated with more positive effects. And so B2, B3, and C after school tend to have the most positive effects. But the middle column tells you that attributes of the program are confounded with the characteristics with the characteristics of the analysis design, and we couldn't really get around this. But we have the weakest research design in the sites that showed some of the most positive effects, and this means that these are interesting findings, but we wouldn't stake high stakes policy on these findings. It's hard to generalize because we don't have a nice randomized design or even a nice difference in difference design for some of the sites. So taking this all together, what did we find? We found that the programs themselves were heterogeneous and the outcomes were heterogeneous. Yet students' experiences, self-reported, were more homogeneous than we had expected. We find preliminary evidence that performance was most positive in the project-based learning sites. But that analysis is not causal, and the sites with the greatest threat of selection bias, the schools of choice, and the after-school program were also the programs with the most positive evidence. We have 6 lessons for policy. One is that this work takes time. This was a 2-year pilot program, and these sites all did what they said they were going to do, but the work toward building a sustainable competency-based model is still very much underway. Policymakers, therefore, should think about near-term outcomes, which are the outcomes we just described, test scores and attendance, but also longer-term outcomes. We've got to see if this works by looking at things like college entrance rates, college persistence rates, and ultimately college graduation rates for these kids. And we need to do it with research designs that allow for rich, meaningful comparisons, generalizable comparisons. We also note that flexibly timed accountability tests, that is, when we're testing kids annually and they're not all getting the same content at the same time, that may hurt kids' performance on annual tests. So if we had accountability tests like some states are starting to do, Oregon is one that comes to mind, where students have there's a more flexible window in terms of when kids take the accountability test, that might allow for better estimates of what kids have learned in a competency-based system. The next two are about partnerships. Partnerships between districts and developers of online tools and resources really need to view these districts as partners and allow for scalability of the materials, because some of the sites that we observed had difficulty scaling up their programs because they didn't have licenses to use the materials that they had helped build. Another piece about collaboration is that the details of the programs should take into account the infrastructure. So if your program is to develop lots of online resources and yet you don't have enough computers to allow your kids to get online, then perhaps some of that funding should go toward building that infrastructure. Finally, competency-based systems must be vigilant about equity, given that students are being allowed to move at their own paces, and given that they're having more choices about how they demonstrate learning. That calls for the need for additional support so that students who have struggled historically with academics do not disengage when they can no longer be incentivized based on effort. So that's where we end, and I'm sure there are many questions which Matt and I are happy to respond to.
So thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. That was very interesting and gave us a sense of very different kinds of schools, different grade levels, and contexts. So let's start with the two really specific clarifying questions. One person wanted to know what learning management system the pilot sites used. I don't know if they used if each of them used different ones. Let's start with that.
They were all different, and I think I guess we're allowed to say one of them was Educate, which is a popular one for competency-based learning. Another one I'm not going to say because it was the sites will not be masked in the final report that comes out in 2 months, but for now we have to mask the sites. So one of them I'm not going to say because it could reveal the sites. And the third one was a product built by Pearson for this particular district. And it was designed to be integrated with SchoolNet, but wasn't really integrated. So I think that's still under development.
And if I could, Jennifer, this is Matt Lewis, some of the earlier comments by Erika on the work in Maine and the centrality, the importance of having a learning management system that can take some of the huge burden off of the individual teachers for trying to track up to, as Erika mentioned, 150 students at a really fine grain size and be able to mention, for example, about competencies and about next steps and materials is a huge burden. And we saw this across sites where teachers were having to try to do this by hand using Excel spreadsheets, and at certain points, if the grain size is fine enough, it becomes too hard. And teachers will throw up their hands and understandably say, I need a better tool for this. So the importance of having a mature learning management system that's nicely integrated into the other learning management systems or the other information systems, student information systems in a district, is going to be critical to success as these reforms go forward.
Yeah, thank you. Another clarifying question is about the other teachers in the schools. You were looking at teachers teaching certain grades and subjects. Were all the other teachers using proficiency strategies as well, or not?
So this varied by site. And it's the reason we were able to use a whole district approach in Program A and a whole school approach in programs and all of the Program B sites. And that's because in Program A and all of the Program Bs, all of the teachers were using competency-based or proficiency-based approaches. In Program C, this was really a pilot. And so teachers volunteered, and it was it was 8 teachers spread across 6 schools. So there was definitely some more heterogeneity in Program C than in the other sites. But even in the other sites, even though everybody was using a competency-based approach, there were reported to be differences in the extent to which teachers were really embracing rubric-based learning. Rubric-based evaluation, I should say.
Thanks. And last, before we turn it open up for broader questions, can you talk a little more about non-motivated students? There was a question about strategies that teachers were using or thought were important to use for students who didn't seem engaged or motivated.
Well, I can say that in one site where this came up in an interview, the staff member said, we have a program in place to make sure that those kids excuse me, get the best teachers and get access to the best instruction. So that sounds like more like, it's not exactly an RTI, response to intervention approach, but the idea is that he said, for our strongest students, we send them to something that is really much more autonomous, and we make sure that the kids that are struggling are getting placed in front of teachers that are going to really spend time with them. So that's more of a triage approach that is on par with a response to intervention model in some ways. But Matt may have more to say about this.
Yes, one of the other main effects that you see when we went to these various sites was when you're doing an innovation like this, it takes not only time for the teachers to get up to speed and for the supporting infrastructure, the information systems, but for the students to shift. This is a really radical shift for the parents and for the students as well. And so students who have only been exposed to this for a year or 2 years, they're still trying to figure out how you work and succeed in this new system versus the old system. And so one of the sites that we went to, they were actually building the innovation from the earlier grades up through the more senior grades, and we found the kids that had been introduced to this most recently that hadn't come up through the system for multiple years. There was a lot more of lack of buy-in and it was actually harder. We heard students that say things like, well, the old system was a lot easier because we weren't as accountable and we don't like this system. So they hadn't come up through the system and had embraced the different style of learning and teaching and interaction that was required by this new system. So I think one of the other themes is that as students develop the skills and the metacognitive skills and the self-management skills that are going to be required in this kind of competency-based education, I think we'll see some of these differences attenuate.
Thanks. And one last question for you specifically. David asked, any hypotheses about why Site A outcomes were negative?
One hypothesis is that the assessments were not well aligned to what kids were learning. Because once kids were learning at their own pace, they were not necessarily all getting the grade level content at the same time or even in the grade when they would normally have gotten it. So that's a reasonable hypothesis. Now, ultimately, you would want a system, if you agree that the Common Core standards or that the state standards are what everyone should learn, you would want a system where ultimately kids are getting to a place where they would have been before as fast as they would have been before or faster. But it may be that because of the growing pains, the implementation dip of such a dramatic transformation as Matt was describing, it might take a while to get back to equilibrium.
Yeah, and just I think Jennifer's the point about this implementation dip. Folks that do big innovations, literally, this is with a large district, suburban district that has low SES students, a good number of low SES students. These kind of changes are huge when you go into an entire district and go to a competency-based model. And so you can often, when you go and do innovation, you will do worse because you're varying so many variables and people are trying to understand and figure out how to work this new system. So it's not uncommon for innovators to experience a large dip when they try to innovate, and what they have to do is then push through that innovator's dip to where they can try to increase that slope and get back up to and then eventually exceed the performance of the other, in this case, the other districts within the state.
Thanks. And now I'd like to ask some broad questions that will go, that I'd like to invite Erika to jump in on as well. The first one is really about equity issues. One of the reasons that people propose to use competency-based learning is in order to reach a wider range of students. And the question came for Jennifer and Matt's study because you had student engagement surveys and wondered if you had done any disaggregation by race, ethnicity, gender. It could be SES as well, I would think. And I wondered if in either study, if you addressed those kinds of subgroup issues and what you saw or found about how this innovation helped people reach more students.
We have done some disaggregation by subgroup, and I think we see a lot of similarity among racial ethnic subgroups, but I think that we are still. I'm not quite ready to speak on that yet, but that will be it is in the report, and it will be in the final report.
This is Erika, and I could talk to that just briefly. One of the things that we found was, as you mentioned, in Jennifer's study, looked at that student engagement anecdotally in our interviews was one of the biggest benefits of the changes that schools had made, increased student engagement in learning. And we also looked at the idea and spoke with some people about equity in terms of access and student pacing, and that there was some conversation around the fact that this process and personalized learning specifically certainly did allow for greater access and for students to feel more a part of their class work. But there was also concern, as the RAND study indicated, that if some students were allowed to move at a pace that was not motivated by a teacher or the school, but simply by themselves and their families, that presented a situation that could mean that some students fell behind where they should be or where they were expected to be for standardized testing, age-based expectations. And we did see in previous studies, we have a study of more efficient schools, higher performing, more efficient schools, as well as a study of improving schools here in Maine. And we saw equity and the attempt to engage and pull intellectual work and high quality work out of students at all places in life as a really key aspect of improving and higher performing schools.
And one more thought. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, just another thought on the equity issues. They are an area that many of the stakeholders that we interviewed outside of the districts across the country that are doing innovations in CBE. There's great interest in this issue of, will this rising tide of CBE, with all the promises that are made for it, will it really raise all boats, or will there be interesting or strong effects across different groups, as we've been talking about? And so that's an area of great concern and an area that we're going to be studying going forward.
Thanks. We had a couple of questions about administrators, and as one is, how do we involve and make sure that district superintendents are kept up to speed on this issue and its implementation? And another was, how do we make sure that senior administrators, including school board members and parents and community, are can hold their support through the implementation dip? So one, I think, is about educating, and the other is about communicating. In either of your studies, did you learn anything about those issues, or do you have any advice?
I can speak to, this is Erika, I can speak to the first piece. We found actually that since our case studies were schools and school districts that had chosen to really implement before the legislation had to legally be in place, that this was often initiated by superintendents and district-level administrators. So that engagement was really powerful and valuable. But we also heard in a section of our report talking about technology that it was really critical. Technology played a really important role, as Matt indicated, in terms of identifying and keeping track of all of the data. And it was really critical to have the technology administrators and experts in the district be involved in some of the visioning and development of this system of proficiency-based, because otherwise technology became sort of a tack-on at the end, and it wasn't efficient or effective in that manner. So many technology experts that we interviewed really said that it was critical to have those administrators a part of the process from the beginning.
Thanks, Erica.
We could talk about what one of the sites had been very deliberate in thinking about engaging parents and teachers. So they had only made the conversion after a certain percentage of teachers had voted in agreement, and they had done tremendous outreach to parents to help them understand what this is and why they're doing it. And they reported anecdotally that it was the parents of struggling students who said, we appreciate that we're finally getting something that tells us how our child is doing, because we knew that there were problems, but they weren't always apparent on the report card in a way that we thought was actionable.
And to back that up, that this is the full district model that was implemented, that this kind of buy-in and taking the time to get that buy-in, the administrators and the school board that pushed for this, they felt that was critical, and they spent years building knowledge in the community and acceptance in the community, but also acceptance within, as Jennifer has mentioned, within their teacher population. And some of these sites that we visited are a part of the Reinventing Schools Coalition, and one of the mantras that we had heard across sites is that the parents have to understand that in some of these sites, there's a good percentage of the kids are just, it's not working for them. This system doesn't work. The graduation rates are in the 60% or 70% or lower. So this system is not working for a good chunk of the kids in the community, and it's broken. And the mantra is there's no going back. You're going to make this change, and you're going to have to work with it, because what we had didn't work for our kids. So we must go forward and find a system that works, and this is a good candidate.
I think that's a good point. I think also there's an issue, you mentioned, Jennifer, near-term outcomes for policymakers, and I think that's an issue of holding people through the implementation dip. Are there kinds of near-term outcomes that you saw in any of the sites that both of you looked at that seem to be able to hold people, say, oh, okay, this is starting to work, we can wait for the next level?
I would say that we would like, there are more outcomes that we would have liked to look at, but sometimes the historical records did not have enough years in them that would allow us to look at them. So we were excited, for example, in Site C, even though we didn't see an impact on test scores, we saw an impact on attendance. So that's an engagement indicator for a high school kid, because high school kids have some autonomy about whether they show up. So I think the other piece is, I think it really does have to do with the student engagement piece. So at some of these schools are schools of choice, and granted, some of them have higher test scores than their demographics would indicate, which automatically becomes a magnet for parents. But not all of them do. So one of them was kind of lagging, and yet they're giving kids these choice-based experiences, these project-based learning experiences. There are opportunities for travel. And so I think that by demonstrating rich engagement, and if kids come home and they're doing cool things that are connected to the real world, that may be a selling point on its own. But I do think that, ultimately parents want to know, are my kids going to be able to get a job? Are my kids going to be able to get into college? And that really is what these systems have the responsibility to deliver. And if they aren't delivering that, they're going to lose parents.
I would add to that I think that that's sort of what we were saying in our report about the idea that it's really a systems change, in that when you ask, for example, if colleges accept proficiency-based diplomas, or if the outcomes that students are measured by, standardized tests, are improving after this implementation, it's really difficult to evaluate the benefits of such a system that really heralds different elements of education, And that needs to also be how it promotes itself. And it's very tricky to do that in many schools at this time, public schools at this time. But I think that many of those schools are beginning that conversation in a really important way.
Thanks. And I think I'm going to end on Betty's question. It seems that proficiency achieved on a timetable remains an element within these programs. Isn't an at-your-own-pace system more appropriate and perhaps essential for mastery and true evaluation? And this relates to the issue that kids are still having to take state accountability tests at a certain time. How do people fit those things together? How do you move to a more at-your-own-pace system? Do any of you have any thoughts about those issues?
I would say that I think that that was one of the biggest difficulties that we saw in the logistics that people spoke about in our studies, was that the ideas and the philosophies behind student-paced learning or personalized learning people believed in, but when you started to think about whether a student really would be able to stay in a public school system for as long as they wanted to. I think I had a quote from a superintendent that said, we don't have taxpayer dollars to be able to support that. And so I think that there are some very fundamental logistical aspects of a traditional education system in the United States. And there are models out there that have change that. There are different ways of approaching that, but the traditional system based on public funding has a difficult time with allowing that to happen.
I guess
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, just comment on some of the language here. Self-paced and going at your own pace, we tend to think about that as the kids that are at the top end of this learning curve and are the ones that are going ahead and perhaps outstripping some of their colleagues within the same cohort. We also find that instead of being self-paced at the bottom end of that distribution, it's really not self-paced because the teacher is not going to let the kid do nothing. The term that we had heard used was teacher-paced as a minimum. So the teacher is monitoring the performance of the kids and students and is ensuring that they don't fall behind too far and that they are still progressing going forward. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention was that it's not just about the pace that you get through it, but in the competency-based systems, there's depth as well. So it's not that you want to jet through and get to be minimum proficient, and that's how you're going to get out. There's also the option to go deeper within the competency within a learning area, and that may take more time, but it will get you more depth.
And I would just, I definitely agree with that. I would add that we still need a metric that holds the schools accountable. And whether it is a standardized test or some, a college entrance rate or a rate, if you require all kids to take the ACT, there has to be a common metric by which schools are held accountable, and that's kind of a premise of the standards-based reform of the 90s that led us to No Child Left Behind for all its flaws. And the other thing from the student's perspective is that there is an opportunity cost once you are an adult to not having some kind of credential. So for the student, there's a financial cost of not completing at the same rate as everyone else. So if you're going to take longer, you have to make sure that you're actually getting more and that you are going to, and that credential that you're going to get is going to weigh more so that it validates the extra time that you've spent.
And I think that that is certainly the benefit of such a system is the depth that you could go into and the more amazing kinds of experiences you could have. And it's really important for a parallel system of, as you've said, to monitor and reflect that for example, on a high school transcript, to indicate that proficiency or above proficiency means something deeper.
So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds, I guess, since I just got a 1-minute warning. Just one of the things people are most interested in is, does this work? And your research is preliminary. You're studying preliminary implementations. How would you answer that question, given the research that you've conducted? Jennifer, you want to start?
I would say that right now I would put my money on project-based learning that is rich and engaging and authentic, assessments that are authentic in the sense that they reflect what kids are going to be asked to do in real-world tasks. And based on the evidence we have, that's where I would put my money. But I say that with huge caveats around the data that we have, because they are still subject to selection bias. And so I would still say, we got to do another study. Sorry.
Matt?
Yeah, I think that the jury is still out. I am personally optimistic, having been in some of these environments, gone and do observations and interviews with kids and with students and teachers, and so I'm optimistic. However, there are huge barriers to the successful implementation of this, and those come across in spades when you're in the sites and you see the realities of how hard some of this innovation is. So I'm still optimistic, but I think as the jury is still out, and we're going to be looking for that data over the next few years.
Thanks. And Erika, you have
I think that what I said before, that it depends on how you define it, and it depends on how you define works. And so, as Jennifer said, we need another study to define those, right? But I do feel that some really critical steps are being made in education reform, in professional collaboration, and having students' voice not just be an anecdotal piece of work, but really working diligently to have that be a part of accountability. And I think most importantly that the conversation around the fact that every child should have the opportunity to engage in deep and challenging learning experiences is at the top of the table. And that's a huge step towards the possibility of that becoming a reality.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you, both the presenters and the participants, for your questions that made this really a rich conversation. We'd like you to take the stakeholder feedback survey about how was this webinar for you and what kind of feedback do you have for us. And while you do that, Aubrey will tell you a little bit about our works in progress here at RELNI.
Great, thanks, Leslie. So we have 2 reports that are coming out. They're scheduled to come out this summer. The full report examines definitions of proficiency and competency-based learning from across the RELNI region, which includes 7 states. And then we also looked at barriers and facilitators to implementation. And I know Jennifer started with a whole definition of competency education. It's a huge issue in terms of how do we define this. So we conducted policy scans across all 7 states in the region, and then we conducted interviews with 20 state, district, and school-level administrators in Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. In particular, we interviewed leaders from districts or schools that had implemented proficiency and competency-based learning, and districts and schools that had considered the reform but not yet implemented it. So the full report outlines findings from the study, and then we also have a policy brief, which is a companion report. It's based off of the full report, but it's a little different. It's not just a shortened version of the full report. Instead, we focus on 2 main findings and outline considerations for policymakers and educators as they're thinking about implementation of the reform. So be looking out for those hopefully this summer.
If you'd like more information about the work that we're doing or you'd like to join us, feel free to email any of us here or to visit our website. and go to our page and ask to join our alliance. Thank you all. We really have learned a lot from you and have enjoyed this conversation. And again, thanks especially to Erika Stump, to Jennifer Steele, and to Matt Lewis for sharing the results of this early research. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you, Leslie. And this concludes today's Bridge event. Please take the survey, and again, in about a week, we will send out a link to the recording. Bye-bye. Have a great day.